Yay. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dan Mills, my friend, who I met when he was a postdoc in Denmark, and Dan's now a postdoc in Munich, working on various historical geobiology issues. Previously, he's done empirical constraints on the relevance of oxygen levels to early animal life. And he's also exceptionally good at these historical synthesis reviews of major transitions in evolution. So yeah, without further ado, Dan Mills.
All right, well, thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for attending. The group is small enough, so we have enough time, so just ask questions as they come up. So this talk here is about something called the hard steps model. So before I could even, well, the first things first, I have to explain what the hard steps model is.
Sorry, we have no sound.
Sorry, we're just on it. I saw the message. There we go.
Right. All right, Brandon Carter is he's a physicist famous for the anthropic principle. And essentially what he did in 1983, he had this paper where he applied his anthropic reasoning to biological evolution on Earth. And this paper it's fairly well cited. This came out in 1983, and it's maybe not so many people have read it, but the things that it has inspired are a little more visible. So Brandon Carter had a huge impact on this guy on the right, Robin Hanson, who's an economist in the US. And he coined something called the Great Filter in an unpublished paper in the 90s. And then this has been a really popular concept. This is a famous German YouTube channel. This video on the Great Filter has 26 million views. Barrow and Tipler really treated Carter's logic like at book length. This is a very well-cited book. Nick Bostrom has talked a lot about anthropic biases. And then, of course, my introduction to the hard steps model was the book that Tim Lenton and Andy Watson wrote together. So you've probably seen, if you haven't actually read the original hard steps paper, or heard of it, you've almost certainly seen its impact in other work. So essentially, the hard steps model all begins with what Brandon Carter called the remarkable coincidence between two timescales. And so here we have time in billions of years, and it's billions of years after the formation of the solar system. So Brandon Carter wanted to look at two things. He looked at the time that it took for humans to appear. This is essentially the same thing as the age of the Earth as it appears to us. The age of the Earth as it appears to us and the time it took for us to evolve the same time scale. So a little less than 5 billion years. Then he looked at essentially when the sun will leave its main sequence, will leave the main sequence. And he uses this as it's supposed to be different. Anyway, essentially when the biosphere is going to go extinct. So he used that as the upper limit to Earth's habitability, 10 billion years. So to him, actually, as a physicist, he looked at, this is the remarkable coincidence. He thought these numbers are very closely, they're too close, than what you'd expect, given that the processes that dictate biological evolution have nothing directly to do with the physical processes that dictate the aging of the star, or of our sun. So he said, why should these come out to be so close to one another? So he had to explain this, he invoked this third variable that is less constrainable. It's essentially unknowable, and it's the average intrinsic time it takes biological evolution to produce something like human beings, observers who are able to reflect on their existence and communicate about it. So he tried to estimate this. I mean, of course, biological, evolutionary theory is no way of estimating that on first principles, but you went through different scenarios to kind of constrain it. So like one possibility is that the expected average time to intelligence is, say a few 100 million years, right? This is like scenario one that he explored. This can't be true in his logic, because if it were true, we would find ourselves on a much younger Earth. We wouldn't observe such an old planet. This value would be more closer to this one. So he rules that out, as that can't be true. He then explored this possibility that the expected average time is the time that it took for humans to evolve. But he said, this is too much of a coincidence to take seriously. He said we would only consider this if we could rule out the alternatives. So there's one remaining possibility that he looked at, and it's something like this, that the expected average time to intelligence inherently is much greater than the total lifespan of Earth's biosphere. And he liked this one. This was his preferred explanation for the remarkable coincidence. And it involves applying his anthropic reasoning, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, this is true. We obviously exist. And if we are going to exist on the Earth at all, we obviously have to exist before the Earth goes extinct, necessarily. And when that does happen, even if it's really improbable, if it's going to happen anywhere in the observable universe, when intelligent life does evolve on a planet, it's going to evolve on timescales approaching the upper limit of that planet's habitability. So that's the application of his anthropic reasoning. But when you look at it like that, that does explain what he's trying to explain, the temporal coincidence between the time it took for us to get here and the upper limit of Earth's habitability. So this was his preferred solution. And what this means is that our case must be one of the exceptional cases in which evolution has proceeded much faster than usual. Because again, this is the expected average time you would take, but obviously it took, this is one of the rare occurrences where it happened way earlier than you would expect. And another implication of that, or why would it take so long? So that is also part of this. Like, if this is true, why does it take so long inherently for intelligence to evolve? And then he brings up this. So the evolutionary chain, so that's everything from like going from non-life to like human beings now, that entire trajectory. The evolutionary chain included at least one, but probably not more than two links that were highly improbable in the available time frame. So the available time frame is the habitable lifespan of the biosphere. So what are those, these links that were highly improbable? These are now referred to as hard steps. This is exactly where hard steps comes from, is that these links that are required for us to be here, but were inherently improbable to happen within the lifespan of the biosphere. So there's been, since 1983, there's been a lot of people have tried to attempt to identify these hard steps, and there's a good amount of diversity, but there's also a good amount of overlap. And usually it's only Barrow and Tipler, though, and maybe, Tim and Andy were the few to actually like look at criterion, like or criteria for what makes a hard step a hard step. So it needs to be something that if it didn't happen, we wouldn't be here. So it needs to be essential to our existence. Ideally, it should have only happened once. And I'll talk about, actually, I'll expand on this in just a little bit, but most people just kind of listed things that seem important to them. It's just, you know, this seems like it could be a hard step without really applying any strict criteria. But just looking at like this compilation, we can look at the ones that are the most popular or the most frequently invoked. And when you do that, you get a list of 5 candidate hard steps. So life is universal. The origin of life, abiogenesis, is universally posited as a hard step candidate. The origin of oxygenic photosynthesis, the kind of photosynthesis that releases O2 as a waste product. The eukaryotic cell, animal multicellularity, and then last is variably anything from intelligence to Homo sapiens to the origin of technological society. It's for our purposes here, we'll just say intelligence or observerhood, beings that are able to self-reflect and then communicate about their self-reflections. So if you look at the universal tree of life, you could see how these different, everything I just listed here, we could look at these as, you know, traits. And the hard steps, they're steps in the sense that it went from, you know, the transition from not having the state to having the state. If you look at the tree of life, all of these candidates meet the same kind of pattern, and I'll explain. Like if you look, well, everything here is descended from the last universal common ancestor, life. So this is all one clade, and that's life. But like cyanobacteria are just here, eukaryotes are just there. Episticons, that's where humans are, right there. They form the same pattern. So essentially, like if you look at, so in phylogenetics, like if a given innovation is distributed, like this could be flight, for example. Like if you find it in disparate lineages, so like pterosaurs, insects, birds, the trait flight is said to have a polyphyletic origin, and there's multiple independent origins. And then contrast, if something is constrained to a single clade or lineage, a clade is just the last common ancestor of a group and all of its descendants. Then it's said to have a monophyletic origin. And the thinking is that if something evolves multiple times and has this kind of polyphyletic distribution, it's consistent with it being probable. Obviously, it's probable because it happened many times independently. But if something has only evolved once, that's consistent with it being improbable. Obviously, it happened, but you know, the inherent improbability explains why it didn't occur, it didn't evolve again, why it doesn't have a polyphyletic distribution. So essentially, that's the idea. Single is improbable. So if we go back to the tree of life, all of these candidate hard steps, the most popular ones, they all meet this criterion of having a monophyletic distribution in the tree of life. So all of these innovations are constrained to single clades. And what that means is that's consistent with them being improbable. That's the face value interpretation. If this thing has this kind of distribution, that's consistent with it being improbable, which is consistent with them being hard steps, right? That's what you would expect. And this is something Brennan Carter never went into, but it's more or less a confirmation of some of his predictions. The other criterion, so if we look here, like the time it took for humans to evolve, that's the geologic timescale, right? And it was Andy Watson who was the first in the literature to really say that these candidate hard steps should also be equally distributed in time. So this is the other criterion. So the two main criteria, I mean, obviously a hard step needs to be something required for our existence, but then it needs to have happened only once. So that's like the singularities, everything I just said there. And then the other criterion is that they should be evenly distributed in the rock record. So I looked at this, so I just I used like the most conservative like estimates for when these candidate hard steps happened. So I'm not looking at molecular clocks. It's all like the most uncontroversial evidence for all of these things to get the most conservative timeline. But this is what their distribution looks like in Earth history. And yeah, they are more or less evenly spaced. The average duration between these steps is like 800 million years or so. So the situation right now is that if we look at both the rock record and the tree of life, it looks like the hard steps model is supported in the sense that there are these events like the origin of life, evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis that happened in Earth history. If they hadn't have happened, we wouldn't be here. And it looks like they only happened once, which is consistent with them being improbable. And they have this more or less even distribution in Earth history in the past. So the state of things, if you look at all this at face value, this is actually what you would expect if the hard steps model is true. So how I got involved in this in the first place, back in like 2020, 2021, these SETI researchers, so this people who study the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, started involving me in a series of conversations they were having on the hard steps problem. And these are SETI researchers. They don't like the hard steps model because it predicts that extraterrestrial intelligence is, in Brandon Carter's phrase, it's exceedingly rare in the universe. So they're unlikely to be successful if Brandon Carter is right. So they didn't like the hard steps model, and they brought me in to say, we don't like this idea. We want to falsify it. We want to find a way to disprove it or debunk it. And at that point, I was really frustrated with them. I was happy they involved me in this because this is something I always thought was interesting since I read Tim and Andy's book. And it was cool to actually have an opportunity to talk about it. But I said, no, look, like I explained everything I just explained to you. And I said, it looks true. There's a reason why biologists and earth scientists like the hard steps because it looks true. And they weren't familiar with this evidence, but they didn't want the hard steps model to be true as SETI researchers. But after having like a few frustrating conversations, I started getting really interested in this and started thinking, okay, well, just for the sake of argument, if you were to falsify the hard steps model, what would it look like? Like, what would you have to do that? So you would need to explain this, the apparently singular and therefore improbable nature of these hard step candidates. And it's pretty robust in biology to say like oxygenic photosynthesis evolved once in the ancestors of cyanobacteria, or a eukaryotic organization only evolved once. This is pretty well agreed upon. So you need to find some way to get around that. The other thing you need to explain is the timing of these candidates. Why did they evolve when they did? So let's go in order. So the first one, I found a paper. So this is Gerard Vermeij. He's a Dutch paleontologist who works at the University of California in Davis. And he had this paper back in 2006 in PNAS that I thought was really cool. So he actually, and I haven't seen many papers like this. So the title, Historical Contingency and the Purported Uniqueness of Evolutionary Innovations. So he was one of the first few people, to my knowledge, that explicitly questioned the singular status of a lot of these events, major events in the history of life on Earth. So I listed like these candidate hard steps. You know, he talks about those, but he's not coming at this from this hard steps perspective. The claims of evolution of uniqueness in the history of life it goes well beyond this hard steps discussion. But he noticed something that, like, if you look, he made a list of all these purported singularities, and he looked at when they were supposed to happen, and he found that they're overwhelmingly these claimed unique events all happened in the Precambrian, and he suggests that this is information loss. There's insufficient information preserved from that time to rule out multiple origins. So I just want to go through an example that he did talk about that I think is really striking. So if you look at photosynthetic eukaryotes, like algae and trees, they have plastids, right? These plastids are directly descended from free-living cyanobacteria. And it's thought, so like, the way it's usually thought is that there's one primary endosymbiosis event in the ancestors of the clade that includes red and green algae, the archaeoplastids. So the ancestors of modern archaeoplasts acquired their plastids directly from a free-living cyanobacterium. What has since happened in eukaryote evolution is that then you have heterotrophic protists, microbial eukaryotes that have eaten algae and then retain the chloroplasts of the algae they've eaten. So this is secondary endosymbiosis because they didn't get the plastid directly from a cyanobacterium. They got it from another eukaryote that had acquired it from a cyanobacterium. Anyway, for a long time, it was thought that this primary endosymbiosis happened only once, that plastids evolved only once from cyanobacteria and eukaryotes, until a second example was discovered. Pollinella is an amoeboid. You see it's like pseudopods coming out of its test here. It has plastids, and it meets all the criteria for what makes a plastid and not just a highly integrated symbiont. And it's a completely different lineage from the archaeoplast, and it's a different cyanobacterium. And this is, so now this one thing that was once considered a singularity, we now know is not a singularity. This happened, over 1 billion years ago. This happened tens of millions of years ago. And there's a pattern that Vermeyen noted that when you see this, usually you have one clade, like this clade here, is very successful. Like there are hundreds of thousands of land species of land plants and algae and so on. This is a really successful, huge clade. This clade here that independently evolved plastids, there's five members, five species at most. So it's very small, and these smaller clades are prone to extinction. So imagine if Pollinella evolved plastids back in the Proterozoic, 1 billion years ago or so. And that was it. So that means plastids evolved twice in the Proterozoic. This group survives to modern day. Let's say this group here went extinct because it only had a few members. It almost certainly would have not entered the fossil record. So it wouldn't be represented in the Proterozoic fossil record. And then even if it had been, paleontologists today would not be able to discern that this was a second origin of plastids. The only reason we know that now is because of molecular data. If this entered the fossil record in the Proterozoic, a modern paleontologist would just assume it's an archaeoplast or something descended from it. They wouldn't be able to make that distinction. So that's an illustration of how information loss can create the illusion of a singularity when there really wasn't a singularity. This trait in question evolved many times, and there's just one surviving lineage in the modern. So that's actually something like David Rout and other paleontologists talked about this actually like in the 80s. Like I would say it's a pretty common idea that, for example, life itself may have originated many times on the early Earth, and only one of those originations survived to the modern day, and that's everything we now know as life, the clade of life. But there could have been independent origins of life on the early Earth, making these other, capital L life clades, but they've gone extinct. It could be from meteor bombardment or some other mechanism. So that would be an example of information loss. something happened many times and just one example survives to modern day. Something else that he talked about for is that, okay, what I just talked about is the illusion of a singularity. Something happened many times, it looks like it happened once. The other possibility he discussed is that, no, maybe something really did truly happen once, but not because it was improbable, but because it could have only happened once through something called evolutionary priority effects. And actually in the paleontology and ecology literature, they've given this many different names. I think priority effects is probably the best one. And it's essentially something like this. Like, I remember hearing, I think it was, who's the guy who's really into convergence?
Conway Morris.
Yeah, Conway Morris. Like, the way he described it is that, like, the first, like, it's a priority effect. It's like the first one to get, say this is some kind of niche, like, and like oxygenic photosynthesis or something. And the first one who gets there rapidly fills up this niche space and then is highly defensive of it and does not let nascent oxygenic phototrophs impede on this niche space. So it's something like this king of the mountain kind of diagram here. So like this has been modeled by Tony Bernetti and Will Ratcliffe at Georgia Tech. So they imagined like, say there's some kind of, this is what the pattern you get when there's like no evolutionary priority effects, or priority effects with many niches. So like the fact that like bats were still able to evolve flight even though birds were around. So it's not like birds, completely occupied, flight there for, the niche that flying vertebrates fill. So this is what you would get when many different lineages can occupy the same niche and they don't outcompete each other. For anything that's happened, evolved many times, like flight is an example of this. But this is the alternative where there's one niche and evolutionary priority effects are dominating. So like it could be as soon as the first lineage to make this transition, and then they rapidly saturate the available niche space to the point where no other up and coming lineages can break into that niche space. It's been absolutely saturated. Then some kind of intermediate is something here. The authors here were trying to explain there's at least two independent origins of phototrophy in bacteria, retinol phototrophy and chlorophototrophy. And they did some modeling work to suggest that both of these kinds of photosynthesis, they're like on opposite ends of certain fundamental physical trade-offs involved in phototrophy, to the point where one group can't completely occupy all of photosynthetic niche space to the exclusion of the other, but they're sufficiently different that they can both kind of coexist, but they actively prevent independent origins of the kinds of phototrophy they represent. So like retinol phototrophy and chloro phototrophy haven't re-evolved, but it's because these two clades are actively preventing repeated occurrences of this. So this would be the alternative where, something only evolved once, but because it could have only evolved once, or there are reasons preventing subsequent origins and has nothing to do with improbability. So if we go back here, these are at least two ways to get around the apparent singular or improbable nature of our candidates. Again, because it could be some combination that, some of them actually did evolve many times, and there's only one example today. And then maybe for others, they really are singularities, but not because they're improbable, but because of these priority effects. So it could be some combination of them. But if we, so this is one way around this first one. But this raises a problem, because if this were true, like all of these things are really easy and they just look hard, we still have to explain the timing. Why do we find ourselves in such an old Earth close to the end of the biosphere? Why didn't all of this happen in the first few 100 million years of Earth's existence, we need to explain the timing, right? So how do we explain the timing? Well, Brandon Carter, when he wrote this, first wrote the hard steps model, he clearly was under the impression that the Earth has pretty much always been the same, and that humans were just as likely to evolve 100 million years into Earth's existence as they were 4 billion years into the Earth's existence. We now, actually, people knew back then that that wasn't true, but he's a physicist, so I'll give him a break. But we know that that's not. I mean, this is a good compilation. I like this from Peter Crockford, and it's just summarizing, many different ways in which Earth's surface conditions have drastically changed over Earth's history. So I think for this audience, I don't need to break this down too much, but I mean, the Earth has essentially, but even just with redox, so that the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, the Earth has been at least 3 planets, essentially anoxic, low intermediate oxygen levels, and then modern oxygen levels. Right, so that's the big one. I will focus on oxygen a lot. So the other thing is when we go back here, I'll ignore humans for now. All of these groups can only exist within certain environmental conditions. So, and actually like life itself, it has the broadest range of temperatures that it could live under, or oxygen concentrations. But then like once you get to animals, it's much narrower. Animals can't grow at the upper temperature limits that life can. Or life originated under anoxia. Animals, maybe they did not require modern oxygen levels, but they did require some amount of oxygen for their origination. And actually, when you look at this, if you look at the environmental requirements for all these different groups, the more recent they are, the younger they are, the more narrower those conditions are. It's harder to meet those environments. They become more fragile, essentially. They need more highly specific conditions. And the older you go, that's like the broadest. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So if we, for like example, this is something that Tim and Rich Stewart and I worked on, where we looked at like, so this is the amount of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere over time. You could look at certain things like that eukaryotes need to, with respect to oxygen, like they need some oxygen for sterile synthesis. This is a metric of how much, oxygen is consumed by the mitochondria. And then the past to your point, how aerobic respiration over anaerobic respiration. And you look here, the most likely oxygen levels in the Archean are all below these dashed lines, suggesting that there wasn't enough oxygen for eukaryotes. So in this paper, we argued that the rise of oxygen here wasn't directly the main trigger for eukaryote origins, and I still agree with that. But when we look at the oldest evidence for eukaryotes from molecular clocks and fossils, the organic biomarker record, they obviously evolved after the GOE in the Proterozoic when oxygen was around, even if it was low and variable. And to me, this makes sense. Of course, we don't have eukaryotes in the Archean. Like, so while I agree, what we wrote in this paper, this rise of oxygen didn't directly trigger the origin of eukaryotes. I agree with that. I do think you needed oxygen for there to be eukaryotes. So it explains the timing here. And this is just one group, one candidate hard step, eukaryote organization, and it's one environmental variable, oxygen, and it's only looking at the past. Like if we look at the future, so some people have tried to model how much longer Earth's oxygenated atmosphere will last. So this is from Kazumi Izaki and Chris Reinhardt. Here's the present day, and then you have 2 billion years into the future, and essentially in their models, you see here the collapse of Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere. So what that means, so any organism that requires oxygen, right? There was a time in Earth history when that amount of oxygen became established in the past. And there's going to be a time in the future where those oxygen concentrations are going to disappear. So there's an opening of this oxygen window and a closing of the oxygen window. Any organism that requires oxygen is obviously going to find itself in that window. after the environment became sufficiently oxygenated, but before those oxygenated conditions are lost. So this is a kind of thinking I think David Schwartzman illustrated really well. He reversed his time scale. So this is 4 billion years ago. That's today, 3 billion years in the future. Schwartzman thinks that the early Earth was really hot, like over 80 degrees maybe. And what he explained is that over time, as the Earth has cooled, you look at animals, the upper temperature threshold for their growth is like 50. For eukaryotes, it's like slightly higher. And then for like cyanobacteria, it's slightly higher. So he's argued for many years that as the Earth has cooled, that cooling has determined when these different organismic groups first appeared. So like as soon as it was cool enough for cyanobacteria, they evolved. As soon as it was cool enough for eukaryotes, they evolved. But then also he imagines this future Earth that's going to return to the sorts of surface temperatures that characterize the early Earth. And what I like here is that it represents these kinds of, I was mentioning windows of habitability. This is more like basins of temperature, these temperature basins that life can find itself in. So obviously for humans, if this is, just take David Schwartzman at face value and the Earth really was that hot and it's going to get this hot again. Obviously we're going to find ourselves here, when temperatures are cool enough. This is an example of anthropic reasoning. Like we're not going to find ourselves on the early Earth or an even older Earth when it's too hot for us. So I essentially I wanted to do this, where we have Earth history, and then we have 2 billion years in the future, right? And this is essentially like the habitability boundary. Like, when did the Earth actually become hospitable for life? And it's not really clear. I write about this a bit in our paper, but it doesn't look like the Earth was immediately hospitable or conducive to the origin of life or the presence of life as soon as it originated. It may have taken some time, right? The biosphere at some point is going to die. So everything, the history of life has to be constrained to within these two bookends. And then we have our 5 candidate hard steps, when they likely originated and when they will likely die. And then here is this kind of oxygen curve I took from Azaki and Reinhard and just kind of simplified it. And when you look at it like this, you could ask the question, like, when did the atmosphere first become breathable for humans? And I would say probably no later than 400 million years ago or so. And I'm basing this off of, you can look at like the highest recorded, like the highest altitude long-term human settlements, and you could look at the partial pressure of oxygen at those sites, and then you could estimate how much oxygen does long-term human habitation need. But it looks like, when did those first become established? Let's say 420 million years ago, and they're gonna collapse in, I don't know, hundreds of millions of years, right? So this is just for humans and just for oxygen. But you can make this oxygen window for human habitability. And you could also do this though with temperature, like David Schwartzman did, or any other variable that humans need. You could do the same thing. We need to define what those variables are, when they were first met in the past and when they will close in the future. Because it could be, this is just an oxygen window, but it could become more narrow if we apply other variables to it. But also that's just for humans, but we could do this for all of these candidate hard steps. And a lot of historical geobiologists are trying to do this. Like I tried to do this for my PhD, is trying to figure out how much oxygen the earliest animals needed. But again, that was just oxygen. That field, we've not looked at temperature and oxygen together, or temperature, oxygen, and pH together, or salinity. We haven't looked at all these variables. And I think if we started doing this for all of these different groups, we could chart. So it'd be a combination of like physiologists and trying to figure out these requirements. And then it required geochemists and Earth system modelers to begin to reconstruct when those conditions were first met and when they will close in the future. So it could be for all of these different groups, they all neatly appeared as soon as they could within their respective habitability windows defined by all these different environmental metrics. And another thing to point here, like humans, not only did we need like animals to evolve in the past or eukaryotes, we need the continued existence of all of these groups. So the human habitability window also necessarily has to overlap with the animal window, the eukaryote window, cyanobacteria, and life window. I mean, when that's closed, that's the extinction of all life. So, but they all need to overlap. And this has been predicted, Tim has predicted this before. I imagine, without having gone through all these different variables and when they'll close in time, it does seem likely that these groups will go extinct in the reverse order of their appearance, which I think is really interesting. But when you look at it like this, then it explains why humans evolved so late in Earth history, or when they did in Earth history, because that's the only interval in Earth history that they could have evolved in. So if we go back here, the two things we need to explain, we've potentially explained both of these things, which is an alternative to the hard steps model. So essentially, you could refute the hard steps model, at least in practice or in theory, if you do these two things. You need to, these candidate steps, you need to show that they were not improbable. So maybe they actually aren't singular, like information loss, or they were singular, but evolutionary priority effects, not improbability, explains that singular nature. So you'd have to explain that, and you would also, at the same time, have to define the global environmental window for pretty much any variable we can think of. Historical geobiologists have been obsessed with oxygen, but we could think about it with respect to other variables. You have to figure out when it opened, or in this case, the global environmental window for humanity only opened recently in geologic time and will close again in the geologic near future. If we can demonstrate that, then that explains why we evolved now and not in the Archean. It's the same example or application of Carter's anthropic reasoning. For the same reason we don't find ourselves on the surface of the sun, we don't find ourselves living in the Archean or even the Proterozoic. We necessarily evolved within this very particular window in Earth history, essentially the Phanerozoic, and we couldn't have evolved earlier. And we're not going to be able to re-evolve, 300 million years in the future when the biosphere is likely going to be extinct. So when you look at it like this, humans did not evolve early or late, but on time, exactly when you would expect them to evolve in this alternative worldview. Because again, in Carter's world, we evolved like miraculously early in his view. And I would say in geobiology, I would say people say we evolved late. It's not explicitly mentioned, but like Noah Panofsky's Chromium paper says like low Proterozoic oxygen levels and the delayed rise of animals, which kind of suggests that animals would have evolved earlier if oxygen has been met earlier, which is actually pretty consistent with this. But instead of humans evolving early or late, it could be that we evolved right on time in a more deterministic or predictable manner, similar to what David Schwartzman has argued with temperature. So with that, these are the SETI researchers that invited me to contribute to this. So I wouldn't have done any of this without them. But yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention, and would love to talk about this stuff if you have any questions. Great.
So great talk. So if you're now placing a lot of focus on environmental conditions on Earth, certainly now have you now moved the problem to think about this consistently? Sure, you need to now be thinking about the whole exoplanet zoo, particularly in a SETI context. And I mean, just looking at oxygen, for example, there's no particular reason that could work quite differently on other planets.
Right. So how could it be that different? I guess is what I want to know.
Well, I think we've barely started scratching the surface on how it could work. But I mean, it's a quite balanced source and sink on Earth. It seems entirely plausible to me. You could have a Proterozoic. You don't necessarily need a complex life in order to drive oxygen much higher, much earlier on a different planet, or conversely lock it down low forever.
No, it's true. So okay. This always comes, so yeah, in talking to these astronomers about exoplanets, I find, as far as what I can only talk about things that I know about and only talk about the Earth as it's comprehensible to me. I don't know enough about how alternative or how exoplanet, how biogeochemistry operates on these other planets, or you could imagine, alternate planets where, I don't know, maybe they do foster intelligent life and it happens much more quickly given its own internal dynamics or rules, or maybe there are planets where it happens much more slowly. I don't know. But I think I'm imagining the universe is big enough. I imagine there are planets like Earth that work similarly to Earth and that would evolve like Earth has evolved. And I don't know if those, if you look at the observable universe, habitable planets, if those Earth-like planets are the minority or the majority, I have no idea. But I think I don't have a problem with just imagining that these exoplanets are just like Earth in a lot of ways. And then the ones that are really different from Earth, I'm probably the wrong person to speculate about how they work. But I don't know,
I guess it seemed to me it's almost like splitting into two problems here. One of which thinking about Earth and what's plausible and makes sense when you're thinking about Earth or Earth-like planets, and a much harder problem,
right.
which is for the universe in general.
Right, I agree. Yeah, well, maybe we'll see. The next couple of decades, maybe we'll have this sorts of data or start getting it to look at the diversity of
This one.
planets. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Question on the chat.
Yeah.
If you're happy for me to read it out.
Please.
Ellen, who says thank you for the talk. How did Carter first calculate the average time for the evolution of intelligence? Why did he think it would take longer than the sun's lifespan?
Right. So that was his preferred one because, well, can I'll just click all the way through. So it's more like a process of elimination. Like this is the first one he considered that can't be true. This is really funny, actually, in light of everything I just said. He said this can't be true because he can't think of anything that could have delayed our origination. And that's the evolution of the Earth system, delayed our. But anyway, he didn't know that. So he thought humans were just as likely to evolve then as later. So, but he said this can't be true because it's inconsistent with the age of the Earth as we observe it. He ruled this out as too unlikely at face value and would only consider it if this last one was ruled out. And this one he liked because even though it'd be really unlikely for us to have evolved before the sun died, because it's just not enough time usually compared to the average intrinsic time, it obviously happened. And it happened on timescales approaching the upper limit of Earth's habitability. And that's exactly what he wanted to explain, why we evolved so closely to the extinction of the biosphere. And if you take this scenario at face value, it makes sense. Like it explains that temporal coincidence. And it satisfied his reasoning or his logic. And he preferred this one over the other two that I just mentioned. And this is pretty much, I think, at the crux of the hard steps model, is that it makes this assumption that on average takes a really long time for intelligence to evolve, and we just got incredibly lucky on Earth. It happened way faster than it normally does. But that explains this temporal coincidence he was trying to explain.
But just picking up on that question, but doesn't he work from the starting assumption that we're about halfway through the lifespan? So
yes,
how is it the same order of the upper limit? Why did that went a bit fast for me?
This is so it's funny if you go back here, like this is when he thought the biosphere was going to go extinct, another 5 billion years that we're halfway through. It looks even worse than that. You know, the biosphere is going to go extinct much sooner than that. So we're actually even closer. I mean, he's a physicist, so to him, he's like, oh, they're in the same order of magnitude. They're only different by a factor of 2. Because they're talking, cosmologists are talking about these fine tuning problems. They're like, you look at the value ratio and like, and they think those are really remarkable and they're not as precise as this. So like, and but it is weird at some point in his original paper, he made it sound like we're too close to the extinction of the biosphere that needs an explanation. But then at some point, he's also like, but we also have 5 billion years. And it's not that long a time. So that's a long time. So it was kind of inconsistently argued. But this, as I understand it, this is why he prefers this, because
But I mean, isn't that essentially what Andy Watson did in his 2008 paper? That if you now try and do that consistently with an updated estimate for the lifespan of the biosphere, then you predict most likely there's 5 critical steps.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's funny, I just looked at the most popular ones and it gave me 5. Like I didn't apply any, I didn't like predict, I didn't like calculate what n should be or but I think 5, given what we know about when the biosphere will likely go extinct now, yeah, I think 5 steps is, I think most people are happy with that. Or how many did you had 4, Tim, in 2011? Yeah. So 4 or 5, you know. Yeah, Tim.
Good question, but maybe if Carter knew more about the octopus, do you think he'd be a bit more doubtful about his model? They're very intelligent.
Yeah.
Octopus intelligence is dated back to like 500 million years ago or something. So it's yet another instance where
Yes.
you can see that intelligence, by some people's definitions, was hot on the heels of complex animal multicellularity or whatever the previous hard step was hypothesized to be. Could make that case for lots of these, actually, I think now.
No, I agree. And even when he did write about this, he was never really clear what he was trying to explain the likelihood of, like was it Homo sapiens, technological civilization, observerhood? He never defined it, and he used it in every paper he wrote on the hard set model. He like phrased it differently, and so it's not really clear what his criteria are, and then if they also apply to non-human animals like octopi. Yeah.
But the bit I couldn't quite follow down, but we can find in the pub later, was contingency is part of both models.
Yeah.
Your alternative interpretation, but also the multiple steps ones. I couldn't disentangle how then what you're saying about the spacing really differentiated 2 models, both of which you accept that, you know, steps are contingent on previous steps or some of the previous steps.
Right.
So sorry, this is probably too much.
No, this is important.
But
Yeah.
I look forward to talking about that later.
Sure, perfect. Yeah.
There's another one online.
Yeah, please.
From Tim Malone. So the evolution of intelligence is certainly not linear. Do you think that the potential imminent exponential growth in AGI may indicate that intelligence has actually evolved remarkably early in the life of the solar system?
I'm not sure I followed that. I know you didn't write that question.
Do you want to read it?
Why would, so let's say that does happen, this explosion of
Evolution, intelligence, do you think that the potential imminent exponential, do you mean AI?
I think it's AI.
Yeah.
like general AI,
Do
or
you think the potential imminent exponential growth in AGI may indicate that intelligence has actually right, so I think the premise of the question is that once you get a bit of intelligence, it will feed in on itself and accelerate its own rate of probability of evolution, as distinct from other hard steps.
but how would that make, let's assume that happens, what would make,
Sorry if I'm
Us
missing
early.
question. Tim Malone.
Maybe we should,
Yeah.
yeah,
Is there a microphone thing? Do we have that level of technology?
Everything just a second. For me,
But it doesn't every.
it's very easy to keep it friends.
Please, Tim, could you please clarify your question, exactly what?
Yeah, Sure. No. I think you've got it, but I'm just wondering why you think halfway through the 5 billion years, halfway through is relatively late on. I mean, what's to say what's early and what's late?
That's true, yeah.
And it depends a little bit on what you think the ultimate goal is going to be, whether it's assuming we're not talking about human life, because human life is likely only to be here for a very short time, but we're talking about what human life may leave when it's left behind. And of course, that is likely, from what we know at the moment, or at least according to Martin Rees, it's likely to be machine intelligence.
Mhm.
And it seems to me it's quite early in the evolution of a solar system for machine intelligence to develop now.
Yeah, no, I guess, well, if the biosphere is going to go extinct in like a few 100 million years, it would still be late well into Earth's habitable time frame. Like you could still imagine an alternative solar system and Earth where machine intelligence evolved 1 billion years after the formation of the solar system. Why didn't it evolving now actually is late, well into the habitable lifespan of the Earth, close to when it's going to go extinct. So in that sense, I guess it's late, but if the solar system itself is still going to be around for another 5 billion years, then yeah, maybe it's earlier. I don't know.
Machine intelligence is unlikely to be dependent on the Earth for very long.
Yeah, no, it's I know what you mean.
It won't need the biosphere, and the thing about machine intelligence, it can be self-replicating, so it doesn't actually need. It's plenty of time for it to progress without the Earth existing.
But I guess at the very beginning, they need humans to make them.
Yeah.
So
or some other intelligent things. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So at some point, like in the very beginning, they are still coupled to the biosphere before they exit it.
Yeah. That's what we assume. We don't know, but yes, yeah, we assume it could be the other way around. We don't know.
No, yeah, I have to think about this. Yeah, it's interesting.
I think it's more extraordinary that Andy Watson's evolved exactly about halfway through the solar cycle.
Yeah.
I was going to ask what your 2 criteria for refutation of the hard steps thing. It was it the that each step should either be not that improbable or to have occurred multiple times and to have been contingent on various kind of relevant permissive environments. What are the implications of that? If you suppose that reputation is correct, would you comment on the implications for the rate and rate of appearance and frequency of appearance of evolutionary innovation? Because, like, for example, it's say a hard step is in fact not that hard because it arises a lot and that you just get a niche lock-in or whatever. The prediction of that would be that you get the initial origin of events being observable but then going extinct. That would be easier to reproduce experimentally and ecologically. For example, eukaryogenesis. Right. So if eukaryogenesis, say, is not that hard because it's happened multiple times, right, it would be more easy than it actually is to recreate the nascent symbiotic interactions that initiated it.
I guess that would be it would be a prediction of that. Yeah.
So what's your perception of the implications of this view for the rate of internal evolutionary innovation within the biosphere that's necessary for the various different hard steps? What predictions would you make?
Well, I guess as soon as for like a given innovation, when the environment is conducive for it, like it is supportive, I guess this alternative model would predict that it does have like an equal chance of arising within that window. I'm guessing, or like the rate, I guess, would be the same throughout this window, but then in the case of priority effects, they would, none of those, the beginning, it wouldn't be able to get past the very earliest stages before getting
Yeah.
selected against or outcompeted. That's with priority effects. Without priority effects, yeah, you would expect, like, I mean, even today, maybe a second origin of eukaryotes
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something, and which we obviously have not observed, but could be just like with Pollinella and the origin of plastids directly from cyanobacteria. It could be that there are other examples of these innovations on the biosphere today. We just haven't discovered them. But if we don't discover them because they're not there, you know, doing things in the lab might get rid of the priority effects happening in the environment if that's in play. But yeah, I don't know if I understand this about like the rates, like the frequency.
Yeah, well, say if I mean, if you got a prediction of your kind of synthesis at the end would be that various hard steps are happening in nascent form more frequently than we would
the
think,
alternative,
but they're being
right.
locked out by the wrong environment or priority effects or whatever.
Right.
And that would seem to me that would seem testable. And
actually,
if anything,
really
if anything against what we observe, like the origin of life is almost impossible to recreate eukaryogenesis, similar, even, you know, so
right.
What's your sense of how hard steps actually are, I suppose, is one way of.
So, I mean, before I started this, I was under the impression that all of them were truly hard, and I guess in the sense that they're improbable within the available time. And the only reason we reconstruct an Earth with these things is because if they didn't happen, we wouldn't be here. In this alternative, no, the alternative is I don't really think any of this is unlikely. Yeah, it's but you're right. It should be, it is in principle testable. So I mean, I think anyone who's trying to recreate the origin of life in the lab is under the premise that they could do that, or and there could be reasons why it's not happening. I think people have talked about that. That's not happening now because pre-existing life would disrupt the process or interfere, or I mean, these are mechanisms we could look at, like but like, or even like why animals haven't evolved, like there are many lineages of multicellular algae or plants, you know, but there's only one eukaryote that's multicellular and is like animals, like at the cellular level. Why that hasn't happened again, I mean, I think it's more priority effects, and it's just what we need to do is actually figure out what the mechanics of these priority effects are. Because I imagine there are like single-celled eukaryote lineages that do have the potential to become like animals, like lineages closely related to animals, and it could be that they're not realizing that because of these priority effects. But we'd have to look at like how actually pre-existing animals are preventing that from happening. But I think it could be like you look at the genetic potential for, say, animal multicellularity, and you look at its distribution in the tree, and you realize there actually are a lot of lineages closely related to animals that have a lot of the key, you know, prerequisites for multicellularity, even if they're not, you know. So it could be looking at the distribution of potential. I don't know if I could get at it, but yeah, I have to think. I haven't thought too much about how to test it or predict it yet, but.
Okay. Are there any more questions in the chat?
No.
Oh, okay. All right, then let's thank Dan one more time, and if anyone wants to have a chat in room 825, feel free to come along if you're interested in Dan's work. Thanks, Colin.
There is some tea and coffee outside if you want it.
Great, thank you.